All right, well, it's 7 o'clock. Hello, and thank you all for joining this evening. My name is Kirsten Stumpo, and I'm a clinical application specialist for Haag-Streit, USA. During tonight's webinar, I'm going to share with you some tricks and tips on how to take faster scans with the Lenstar. And some of the material I'm going to go over is going to go kind of fast, but we are talking about faster scans. So if you feel like you might need more training at a slower pace, I will be posting a link at the end of this presentation to help you sign up for additional training. Also, feel free to use the chat section to ask any questions you have as we go. According to the American Academy of Ophthalmology, the average ophthalmologist sees around 100 patients in a work week, which I'm sure you are well aware equates to a lot of testing. So I'm here to help make at least one of your daily tasks a little bit more efficient, but without the sacrifice of quality. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's review 10 tips for faster scanning. First, patient positioning. It really does matter. Number 2, coach your patient through the process. If your patient understands what to expect and they know what to do at the right time, they're more likely to cooperate and the scan is more likely to go quicker. Number 3, avoid deleting and rescanning and deleting and rescanning while measuring. If your measurement process goes on a long time, your measurements are likely to get worse over time. Number 4, delete only the measurements that are highlighted in red. The software will actually inform you when there's an outlier that is too extreme to consider the measurement. Number 5, primarily focus on your standard deviations. There's actually a lot of measurements going into the averages that you're looking at in the summary. And the standard deviation is actually what's going to tell you if you have a good scan. Number 6, start validating your keratometry readings first. That's the measurement that typically gives you the most trouble anyway. Number 7, just briefly check your white to white measurements for a normal 12 to 12.5 millimeter reading and for asymmetry. Number 8, check your pupillometry, but only if it matters. I recommend having a conversation with your surgeons and checking to make sure that pupillometry is even something they're looking at. If they do, you really only need to check it if the measurement is abnormal or missing. Pupillometry is used for reference only and not for calculation purposes. Number 9, address cautions on the biometry measurements last. Once you move those gates in the biometry section, the measurement session closes. And if you want to take just one more scan, you'll actually have to start a whole new measuring session instead. Number 10, default your most used template. That way, when you're ready to calculate, your most used template will auto-populate, saving you from a couple extra clicks. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that first tip, patient positioning. And here's a checklist for you. First, tell the patient what to expect. Now, you may have done millions of these scans and you know exactly what to do, but don't forget, this is your patient's first or maybe their second time behind the device. So communication is important at this point because if the patient understands what's expected of them and they're doing the right thing at the right time, it will not only help make the scanning process go faster, it will also improve the quality of the measurements. Certainly, you can put these in your own words, but here are a few things that I like to say right before the patient is in the forehead rest. In a moment, you'll see a blinking light, and I just need you to focus on that light and blink when you need to. The patient should be allowed to blink when they feel dry, but excessive blinking should be avoided. We just want the best tear film for the keratometry readings. The next thing I like to say is we will be taking 5 to 6 scans and there will be a flash of light at the end of each one. That way the patient expects the flash and will be less likely to jump out of the chin rest and sit back. The last thing I like to say before adjusting the patient is try to keep your eye open for the flash and blink a couple of times after each one. During that flash of light, the Lenstar is obtaining the white to white measurement. So if the patient blinks every time the flash occurs, it will be very difficult to obtain the white to white reading. Now we can line up the patient. As the patient is seated on the opposite side of the table, this is a good time to ask them to spit out any gum or mints and request that they refrain from talking during the measurement process. Then I like to use the chin rest to line up with their clavicle or their neckline. So when they come into the chin rest, their chin will come down a bit and gravity will help pull their forehead forward. Now the chin rest style can be used to align the lateral canthus. The software will actually advise you to align the patient this way. And when you're doing this, it's important to be at the same level as your patient, because if your patient is a lot taller and you're looking up at them, or if they're shorter and you're looking down, they might appear to be level, but they're actually not. The reason why this alignment is important is because it puts the patient in a really good starting position so that if they do move a little, they're more likely to stay inside of the range that the Lenstar can actually travel. If the patient moves outside of this range, it will only slow you down. After the patient is aligned, be sure to occlude the non-measured eye. This will help the patient to fixate, and again, help to eliminate movement. Make sure that the patient does not grip the handlebars on the forehead rest. Instead, I like to have them put their hands in their lap and relax their shoulders, because gripping the handlebars can also cause extra movement, especially if your patient is tense or nervous or has tremors. Now, this next one might sound a little strange at first, but briefly check the patient's feet to make sure they're flat on the floor and the patient is stabilized. A patient who's bouncing on the balls of their feet or dangling their feet from the chair are more likely to move. Lastly, right before you begin scanning, ask the patient, are you comfortable? Patient might look all right to you, but if the patient isn't comfortable, again, they're going to be more likely to move, and movement is not our friend with really any device. So many of these tips can be used for other tests as well. While you're scanning, you want to coach the patient through the scanning process. There are 3 words that I have found are very easy to hear and understand. The first one is focus. Asking your patient to focus on the light communicates to them that they just need to do that, and they're more likely to feel free to blink when they need to. And the occasional blink is actually ideal. Then, when each measurement is about to complete, I'll ask the patient to hold for the flash. I like to refrain from saying don't blink, because the last word that they hear is blink, and that's usually what they'll do instead. Lastly, I'll advise the patient to go ahead and blink after the flash is over, so they're replenishing their tear film for the next scan. Then immediately after the scan is completed, I'll repeat focus, so that the patient quickly refocuses, making it easier for the Lenstar to begin the next scan. You see, the Lenstar needs to see the visual axis reflection in order to scan. It's only scanning when the scan is appropriate. Now, before we practice coaching the patient, I'd also like to suggest a basic handhold on the Lenstar that will help you have better control of the device. Here, if you notice, the dominant hand is on the joystick controls and the non-dominant hand on the base, with a finger also on the side and touching the table, and a thumb in the back, again touching the table, and the fingers acting like the tread of your tennis shoes to help maintain more control when adjusting the initial focus. Also, it's a good idea to pay attention to the typical location that the Lenstar ends up on the table when you establish the gross focus alignment. Usually this is when your thumb just barely touches the back edge of the glide plate. Once you figure out that typical gross focus positioning, the fine focus alignment will be very easy to find. Now let's practice coaching the patient. So after adjusting the patient, telling them what to expect, I click on the joystick button to activate the camera and adjust the gross focus alignment. Once the dots are good and separated, click again to adjust the fine focus, then moving slightly in until there are double parentheses and the green dot locks in the center. And the Lenstar takes over and begins focusing and scanning on its own. And then we can let the patient know that they can blink before the scanning process begins. And when the white circle starts going around, we're scanning and we want them to focus. When the circle completes, they'll hold for the flash and blinking in between scans. So focus. When the circle completes, hold and blink. Focus. And the faster they fixate, the faster the Lenstar will begin the next scan. So focus, hold, and blink. Now we're going to move to the other eye. Occlude the left eye, occlude the right eye, do a quick lateral canthus adjustment and check. And then we're going to adjust the gross focus, the fine. And then while the Lenstar is focusing, the patient can blink, but while the white circle's going around, focus and hold and then blink. So focus, hold, and notice the rapid blinking will slow the Lenstar measurement down. So coaching them through the process, focus. And if the lid comes down a little bit, we can advise them to open wider. And if the reflections look smeared or smudged, they might be experiencing some dryness. So we can actually have them take a quick blink. So one more time, we're going to focus, hold, and sit back. So that scan actually took just a little over 2 minutes. So approximately 1 minute per eye. And no, I didn't speed up the video. That was the real time it took to do this scan. Coaching definitely helps with the speed. Now, the other thing that typically slows you down is worrying about those yellow cautions. And I get it, this patient's going to have surgery and cautions lead to fear of making a mistake. But I'm hoping to change this for you. You see, the iSuite software is programmed to place a caution next to an average measurement anytime there's something with that measurement that the software feels questionable. But I want to change your way of viewing cautions. You really should see those cautions like yield signs, the ones like you see when you're driving down the road. When you see a yield sign, you definitely don't stop your car and turn off your engine. You keep driving. Even the help menu in iSuite clearly states that a caution doesn't mean that the measurement is invalid, but should be reviewed in detail. Now, circular cautions indicate asymmetry and cannot be adjusted. These can only be confirmed when they appear. And they will appear when the axial length has a difference between the two eyes of greater than 0.3 millimeters and the Ks if they're different by a diopter or more. You should also avoid deleting caution scans in your dense cataract mode. Removing one of the cautioned average Ks on your dense cataract mode will also eliminate the composite axial length that populates at the top. The composite is actually using the first 3 scans to populate. The only scans that you should delete or avoid including to develop an average are the ones that remain highlighted in red. These scans contain one or more extreme outliers and should be discarded from your average measurements. So really, you should place your primary focus on the standard deviations first, because the standard deviations are actually the numbers that tell you if you have a good average value or not. And yes, I'm saying average because in all actuality, there's a lot of readings going into the averages that we're using for calculation purposes. So there's 3 numbers. You want to commit them to memory: 0.1, 0.25, and 3.5. And if you have trouble remembering those numbers, everyone remembers money. So you can think of them as 10 cents, 25 cents, and 3.50. So let's go ahead and put that into practice. After that last scan was finished, you noticed we had a couple of cautions on 2 of the average Ks, but let's first focus on the standard deviations. Remember, the axial length needs to be less than 0.1, and in this case, 0.01 is completely acceptable. The flat and the steep are both under 0.25, so we're in the clear here, even though we had cautions next to a couple of the averages. Now we're going to check the astigmatism, and for this patient's right eye, there really is not enough astigmatism to consider a toric lens, so we don't really have to be concerned with the axis if the patient really only needs a spherical implant. The only concern here is a caution next to the central corneal thickness, but that can be fixed in the next screen. So now let's take a look at the left eye. Notice we didn't get any cautions on the left eye, but let's check our standard deviations. The axial length is under 0.1, so that's okay. However, the flat meridian has a high standard deviation of 0.29, so we're definitely going to look at that in the next screen. The steep meridian is fine at 0.08, but the astigmatism is questionable. It's a good idea to ask the surgeon how much measured astigmatism do they consider a patient to be a candidate for a toric lens, because 0.92, if it's enough or close, then 4.8 for the standard deviation of the axis would definitely be too high. So we're going to be cautious with the axis reading in this case. Now let's take a look at the details. Upon completing a measurement session and clicking on finish, we come to a complete summary of all the measurements taken. Notice you don't see any cautions here, but by clicking on the keratometry, we'll display the details of the keratometry readings. And here we will see the same cautions we saw on the measuring screen. Now, iSuite automatically crossed off number 4, so it's not even included. And number 2 is cautioned, but the value agrees with the first scan, which is not cautioned. And the reflections look great, and they result in a low standard deviation. The same thing applies for K2, so no need to delete anything. And remember, we didn't have enough astigmatism to worry about the standard deviation of the axis. But the flat meridian of the left eye was high, and we might have enough astigmatism for a toric lens. So we want to look at that as well. Reordering those values helps find the outlier to reduce the standard deviation. And notice by doing so, we have a little over a diopter of astigmatism now. So we'll reorder the axis, remove any outliers, reduce the standard deviation, leaving a majority of the values remaining. Now, let's just take a moment to review what can go wrong with keratometry. When we're looking at our keratometry reflections, we want to see bright reflections indicating good tear film and a center reflection indicating the patient was fixated. Now, sometimes we can catch the patient experiencing a little dryness, sometimes a little tear pooling, and sometimes the lid's coming down too much, or we catch the patient in a partial or a full blink. If the majority of the images produce good reflections and the measurement was not cautioned, producing a good standard deviation overall, we still have a good average. Optimally, though, we do want to see all 4 images with good quality, at least for 1 or 2 scans, along with that low standard deviation. For white to white, I recommend just briefly checking the symmetry between right and left eye. In this case, we essentially have a 12.1 in the right eye and a 12.1 in the left, very symmetrical readings and normal. But let's briefly review what can go wrong with our white to white measurements. Now, clearly this is a good image, and it was very easy for the software to identify a good representation of the white to white measurement. The image quality here made it easy for those calipers to find the horizontal limbus position to the horizontal limbus. But if the patient has a really light iris or scar tissue that might extend over the iris and fading it out, these calipers might struggle a bit, but we can manually adjust that. However, when a patient blinks during the flash of light at the end of the scan, it's impossible to fix with calipers. Let's look at the details of a cautioned white to white. When we open the details of this cautioned white to white, we can clearly see that the patient was blinking. In fact, they blinked each time the image was taken. So none of the images were good enough to consider in this case. Moving to the fellow eye, the same thing happened for each scan. However, the very last scan produced one good image. This was the result of a simple technique that you may already be aware of. When you have a Lenstar with APS, after the initial focus alignment, the Lenstar takes over and drives on its own. Being hands-free will allow you to assist a difficult patient. In the following slide, I have a brief video to demonstrate a technique that you might find extremely helpful. By placing a cotton tip applicator on the brow bone, notice how effective rolling the lid skin up into the cotton tip applicator helps to open the palpebral fissure. I recommend allowing the patient to blink at first, then rolling the lid skin for the scan and unrolling to allow the patient to blink in between. The cotton tip applicator is very slender and avoids interfering with the Lenstar while measuring. If you do not have APS, you may need to have assistance with this technique. If pupillometry is missing, it can be the result of an irregular pupil, but this can be adjusted with those calipers. However, a blink will make it impossible to adjust, just like we saw with the white to white. This can also be remedied by rolling of the lid. When you're validating your measurements, I recommend reserving the A scan until the very end, because when you open this section and move a gate to resolve a caution, it closes the measurement session. So if you needed to take maybe one more scan with a rolled lid, you'll actually have to start a whole new session instead. The last tip I have is to make sure your most used template is set as your default. So this can be done in the calculation section by choosing your most commonly used template and then just clicking the little red tack. So when you navigate to the next patient and you run a new calculation, when you come to the calculation screen, your default template will automatically appear, saving you a few clicks. Now, just for fun, I've included this next video of a scan to demonstrate how quickly you can actually obtain measurements even with the manual mode. So after adjusting the patient, I turned off APS by deselecting the icon. Then with that same handhold I showed earlier, click the button on the joystick to activate the camera, then click again to adjust fine focus. And once we establish double parentheses and a small green circle, then I'll click one more time to measure. Now that small green circle tells me that I found the right distance from the eye. So once I do that, I'm going to hold the Lenstar steady in that position, just using the joystick controls for movements up, down, right, or left to track the visual axis. If my patient stays fairly steady, I avoid forward and backward movements with the Lenstar, maintaining the distance throughout the scanning. So it's one click to turn the camera on and another click to scan in between. So moving over to the other eye, we start the camera, adjust the gross focus, moving into the fine focus. And once we establish the small green circle, click to measure. And the patient can blink before the scanning begins. And we're going to click to activate, click to measure in between scans. So starting out, it's 3 clicks, and in between, if we're going quickly, a click, click, and then we're going to track the visual axis, because if we help the Lenstar keep track of the visual axis, the faster the scanning process will go. And we can combine this with coaching the patient. So we'll click to activate the camera, click to measure, and track, and focus, hold, and blink. Now that scan in the manual mode also took the same amount of time as APS. So scanning and tracking while we're measuring also helps to make things go faster. Now, many of those tips I mentioned earlier to help make scanning faster also help to avoid bad scans. Faster scans reduce the likeliness of the patient getting bored, drying out, or fidgeting. Movement, of course, is reduced if the patient is comfortable, so don't forget to ask your patient if they're comfortable. Allow the patient to blink before the scanning begins and in between scanning. This helps to keep good tear film on the surface of the eye to improve our keratometry. Don't forget to talk to your patient, coach them through the process. So you make sure they're holding for the flash and blinking in between. If you have APS, don't forget your hands free and you can sit to the side and monitor your patient and make sure that they're doing the right thing at the right time. It also allows you to roll a lid if you need to, if the patient's blinking during the flash of light. Watch your standard deviations during the scan. This will kind of help you to be prepared to focus on only those measurements that were variable and had high standard deviations. And in the manual mode, you can actually help the Lenstar stay centered on that visual axis while you're scanning and tracking it while the scanning's going on to increase your speed and improve the quality of your measurements. And that concludes this webinar on tips for faster scanning with the Lenstar. And for those of you who would like additional training, please visit our eShop and you can type the link provided here in your browser. I'm going to leave this information up and we can begin the answering some of the questions from the chat section. All right. Looks like we had some trouble in the beginning. Are we all equipped with dense cataract mode? So that is a good question. Dense cataract mode has been around for a while. So as long as you've been keeping your iSuite software updated, then you should have the dense cataract mode. And that kicks in automatically when the Lenstar knows it's up against a dense lens and is receiving weaker signals back from the retina. So it's auto function. Myopia management is becoming popular. Any specific tips on working with small kids? They're pretty challenging. Yes. So there are a couple tips that I have for working with children. We've had some feedback so far that having them stand up, and a Lenstar table actually has a pretty good range of motion. So it can go pretty low and pretty high depending on the height of your subject. But having a child stand up for a Lenstar reading will sometimes help keep them stable. And again, if they're going to be seated, you might want a platform that they can put their feet on and have their feet flat on the platform if they can't reach the floor. Definitely want to keep them stable. And then also there's are the chin rest papers that you can use if you have a real petite kiddo. You can stack those chin rest papers to bring their chin up a little farther if the chin rest doesn't go up enough for them. But basically, again, talking to your patient, making sure that they understand what to do at the right time. APS is actually not part of software updates. It's a hardware change, but any Lenstar can be upgraded to the most current white light APS model. So if you are interested in the APS, certainly give us a call. I have that 1-800 number there, and you can use the options 2, 1, and 2 if you're interested in upgrading your Lenstar. I don't know if any of you noticed, but it kind of went fast. And I think it was the last video I showed you. One of the measurements were highlighted in red, and if you noticed, I didn't delete it. I just kept letting the scans go, and it actually corrected itself on its own. So those red scans will be indicative of extreme outliers, but if you allow the Lenstar to keep scanning, sometimes it finds measurements that are closer to that, that extreme. So it's fine to leave that in and then manage your standard deviations in the details. So next question is, does the computer I'm using affect the speed? So not the speed of the Lenstar, but maybe you're experiencing some slowdowns in the software. So that could be caused by a couple different things. If your Lenstar is networked, you might want to check with your IT to see if the networking speed can be increased. You also want to make sure that you're on the right specifications for the software. I recommend being on our iSuite version i9 6.3. I find that's like the best release that we've come out with. And it does require a Windows 10 PC with certain specifications, so plenty of memory. You want to check with our technical support team to make sure that your computer is meeting the specifications for that version of software. And that's the option 2, 2, and 3. They'll be happy to help you. And if you need to upgrade your computer, we could also provide you with a computer with the software already loaded. And I'm just going to give you guys a few minutes to ask any more questions that you might have. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I'll conclude this webinar, but I just want to thank you all for attending, and please feel free to reach out to us if you need anything further. Thanks so much and have a great evening.